Welcome, dear listener, to Candlelight Mysteries, where every whisper hides a truth and every shadow conceals a secret. Tonight, as the wind sighs against the glass and the flame trembles low, we invite you into another tale of suspense and candlelight. Let the mystery begin. Chapter 1. The Lanterns Glow. Snow drifted gently across the rooftops of St. Mary Mead, softening every edge and silencing every sound except the faint hum of carolers near the church. The air was sweet with pine and smoke and the promise of Christmas. At the heart of the green, the great winter lantern, polished each year by the vicar himself, glowed softly, its light pooling like golden honey across the snow. It was a sight that brought comfort to most of the village. But to Miss Marple, standing quietly at the edge of the crowd, it brought something else entirely, a sense of unease, faint but certain. Like the prickle of cold air beneath one's collar, Mrs. Linton was fussing near the refreshment table, clucking at the uneven distribution of mince pies. 3 each, mind you, unless you're Mr. Barnes, who took 4 last year, she scolded, though her voice held that peculiar satisfaction reserved for those who enjoy their indignation. Near her, the vicar was leading the carolers through God Rest Ye Merry. Gentlemen, his baritone earnest but a touch off key. Miss Marple's knitting needles rested in her muff, her fingers absently tracing the wool as she watched. She noticed the smallest things, how Mrs. Linton's hands trembled when she poured the tea, how the postmistress avoided meeting anyone's eyes, and how Mrs. Evelyn Carraway, so recently widowed and already whispered about, stood slightly apart, her gloved hands clasped too tightly before her. "It's a fine evening for it," said Mr. Pettigrew, the grocer, coming to stand beside her. "If you don't mind the cold, that is," Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Cold keeps one honest, I think," she replied, eyes still on Mrs. Carraway. "It shows who is comfortable and who is pretending." He gave a good-natured laugh. Not understanding in the least what she meant, the lantern flickered suddenly, dimming to a weak glow before brightening again. A murmur ran through the crowd, and Mrs. Linton gasped dramatically.
"The flame's gone queer. That's never happened before, not in all the years since my father lit it with his own hands." "Perhaps it's the wind," someone offered, but there was no wind.
The night had fallen perfectly still, and then, from somewhere beyond the churchyard wall, came a faint cry, sharp, distant, and terribly human. For a moment, no one moved. Then the vicar, his cassock flapping awkwardly, hurried toward the sound with 2 young men from the choir. Miss Marple's gaze followed them, her expression unreadable. She noticed the way the snow near the lantern had been disturbed, brushed almost clean in a small circle. Too tidy for chance, the crowd grew restless.
"Probably a fox," muttered one of the farmers.
But Miss Marple knew the difference between the cry of a fox and that of a frightened man. Within minutes, the vicar and his helpers returned, their faces pale and voices low. The music faltered, then stopped entirely. "There's
"Been an accident," the vicar said softly.
Mr. Henry Withers.
He's gone, I'm afraid." Gasps and murmurs broke out like ripples in a pond. Mrs. Linton dropped her ladle.
Miss Carraway's face went whiter than the snow. Miss Marple said nothing. She merely adjusted her scarf and began walking toward the churchyard. The body lay beneath the winter lantern, half shrouded in falling snow. Henry Withers had been a quiet man, a clerk of sorts who lived alone and seldom joined village festivities. Yet tonight he had come, neatly dressed, as if expecting something or someone. His cap lay a few feet away, and in his pocket was found a folded note, damp from the snow, the ink blurred beyond reading. The police constable, young and uncomfortable, shifted from foot to foot. "No signs of a struggle, Miss Marple," he said nervously as she approached. "Looks like he slipped, perhaps." "Indeed?" Miss Marple's tone was kind, but her eyes were sharp as she bent to examine the snow. And yet one wonders how a man could fall so neatly upon his back without disturbing the powder around his boots. Such precision is unusual in accidents. The constable frowned, clearly uncertain how to reply. She leaned closer. A small flash of colour caught her eye, a sliver of blue caught between the dead man's fingers. Gently, she lifted it free. Silk, torn, a woman's fabric. Without question, she said nothing of it aloud, only tucked the fragment discreetly into her handkerchief. By morning, all of St. Mary Mead was alive with speculation. The death of Henry Withers was the talk of every hearth and teacup. At the post office, Miss Hartwell confided to her closest friend quite loudly that she'd seen Mrs. Carraway speaking to Mr. Withers only yesterday and looking none too pleased about it. Mrs. Price, the dressmaker, claimed the deceased had been asking about money owed to him, though whether by a client or a friend, she could not say. Even the vicar's niece, Clara, was drawn into it. "He was kind to me once," she said tearfully, "but he'd been different lately." Nervous, always watching the lantern, Miss Marple listened, nodding gently as each piece of gossip unfolded. "People change in winter," she murmured. "The cold brings out what's hidden." She spent the afternoon calling on neighbours under perfectly innocent pretences. To Mrs. Linton she brought a jar of jam, and while Mrs. Linton prattled about the shock of it all, Miss Marple's eyes took in the details: the freshly scrubbed teacup by the sink, the faint scent of brandy, the gloves drying near the hearth.
"You didn't go near the green last night, did you, my dear?" she asked, purely conversational. "Certainly not."
"I was here all evening. Just ask Mr. Linton." "Ah," said Miss Marple softly. "So you were both home? That's comforting." By dusk she returned home and set her knitting aside. Outside her window, the winter lantern flickered once more in the distance. She thought of Henry Withers, his careful clothes, his blurred note, the silk in his hand. Someone had brushed away the snow around him with deliberate care, leaving no trace of struggle. But one cannot so easily brush away guilt. Her maid, young Gladys, appeared at the door. "Will there be an inquest, ma'am?" "Oh, yes," Miss Marple replied gently, eyes distant. "There will be questions and answers too, though not all of them truthful."
People are always honest in the wrong places. That night she couldn't sleep.
From her window she could see the faint glow of the lantern reflected against the frosted glass. It reminded her of a watchful eye, keeping its own counsel. Somewhere in that light lay the truth, she was certain. The trick was simply to notice what others missed: the uneven steps, the too clean snow, the absence of gloves on those who claimed to be cold. When the church clock struck midnight, Miss Marple smiled faintly to herself and whispered, "No, my dear Henry, you didn't fall. Someone helped you down." The village slept, dreaming of Christmas. Only Miss Marple sat wakeful, the soft click of her knitting filling the quiet as the winter lantern shone steadily on. And Miss Marple, smiling kindly, knew she had just seen the first shadow of murder. Chapter 2. Tea at the vicarage. It was said, rather confidently by Mrs. Price at the bakery that morning, that Mrs. Carraway hadn't slept a wink. Word travelled fast in St. Mary Mead, faster than the post, and with far more detail. By the time Miss Marple set out for her morning tea at the vicarage, half the village was convinced the poor widow had been seen wandering near the church after midnight, wearing only her black shawl and carrying a lantern of her own. The vicarage was warm and cheerful when Miss Marple arrived, though the air carried that particular stiffness that comes after scandal. Mrs. Weatherby, the vicar's wife, fluttered about like a nervous wren, setting out plates of currant buns and sugar biscuits as though an excess of sweetness might cleanse the bitter taste of gossip. "My dear Miss Marple, what a shocking business," she sighed, pouring tea with trembling hands.
"Poor Mr. Withers, such a dreadful accident, though one does wonder what he was doing out so late."
"The constable says he must have slipped, but I can't help thinking."
"Well, it was rather too cold a night for a stroll, wasn't it?"
Miss Marple smiled gently, accepting her cup. "Quite so. The cold has a way of keeping most people indoors, unless they have something urgent to attend to." Her eyes, bright and inquisitive, lingered a moment on Mrs. Weatherby's face, watching the flicker of unease there. From the sitting room came the low hum of the vicar's voice as he sorted correspondence, punctuated now and then by the scratch of a pen. His wife lowered her own tone. Of course there was that unpleasantness over the church funds last spring. Mr. Withers was quite upset when his bookkeeping was questioned. The vicar said it was merely a misunderstanding, but you know how people talk. Miss Marple nodded. her expression thoughtful. Yes, misunderstandings do have a way of lingering, especially when money is involved. There was a pause, filled only by the clink of china and the faint ticking of the mantel clock. Then Mrs. Weatherby leaned closer. "And there's more, I'm afraid." Mrs. Carroway was seen speaking with him the very day before by Mrs. Linton, of all people. She said they were quarrelling quite fiercely just beyond the post office. "Something about a promise." "Promises are tricky things," said Miss Marple softly. "They make fine threads between people, but pull one too hard, and the whole fabric can tear." Mrs. Weatherby nodded gravely, clearly relieved to have such delicate talk shared with someone so discreet. "I don't like to judge, of course. Evelyn Carroway's had a difficult time since her husband passed, but she does seem, well, rather proud for a woman of limited means. Keeps herself apart, never quite mixing with the village." Miss Marple sipped her tea. "Pride often covers fear, I find."
"And fear, my dear, is a great motivator." At that, Mrs. Weatherby's gaze flickered to the window, where snowflakes drifted lazily beyond the lace curtain.
"They say she was seen near the churchyard after the carols ended," she whispered, "carrying her own lantern." "Indeed?" Miss Marple set down her cup with a soft clink. "Curious that. Considering there was a lantern already burning there, and quite brightly too." A faint sound from the hallway interrupted them, the door creaking open, a step on the wooden floor. Clara Whitby, the vicar's niece, appeared with a tray of biscuits. Her young face was pale, her eyes rimmed red.
"Auntie, I thought I'd bring the others," she murmured. "Oh, thank you, dear."
"You've been a great help today." Clara smiled faintly, but her hand shook, and a biscuit slid from the tray to the carpet. She blushed furiously. "Oh!" "I'm so sorry, Miss Marple." "Not at all, my dear," Miss Marple said kindly.
"You must be tired."
"Such excitement in the village can unsettle anyone." Clara hesitated.
"It's only that, well, I saw him, you know. Yesterday afternoon, Mr. Withers, he asked me to deliver a note to Mrs. Carroway. I didn't think anything of it then." "Did you read it?" asked Mrs. Weatherby sharply. "Of course not. But I heard him say something about a promise unpaid." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the faint rattle of the kettle on the stove.
Miss Marple's expression didn't change, but her eyes softened with a peculiar sympathy. "It must be difficult for you, Clara," she said gently. "To be mixed in such sad business." Clara nodded, tears gathering. "He was kind to me once, when I first came here. But lately he'd been different. Nervous. He said strange things about debts that—"
"Couldn't be repaid," poor man murmured.
Mrs. Weatherby, perhaps he owed money himself. Miss Marple stirred her tea, her tone casual. Or perhaps he was owed something and meant to collect. Outside, the church bell struck 11. The sound lingered, solemn and echoing before fading into the hush of falling snow. A little later, Miss Marple took her leave, thanking Mrs. Weatherby for her kindness. The vicar himself escorted her to the door, his face drawn and weary. "It's a most distressing affair," he said. "The constable insists there's nothing suspicious. A simple fall, he says. But I can't shake the feeling, well, that the Lord's hand may have guided it. Mr. Withers was not always entirely honest." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "The Lord's hand, perhaps? Though I've often noticed that Providence and human nature walk very closely together." As she stepped out into the cold, she paused, glancing toward the churchyard. The winter lantern gleamed faintly through the mist, its golden light wavering. A small figure moved there, Mrs. Carroway, wrapped in her shawl, head bowed. Miss Marple stood a moment, watching. She saw the widow's hands clutching her gloves too tightly, as though to still their trembling. Then Mrs. Carroway turned sharply, and the expression on her face, half guilt, half sorrow, was gone in an instant. That afternoon, Miss Marple made her rounds in the village. At the bakery, Mrs. Price confided that Mrs. Carroway had quarrelled with her late husband's solicitor last month. Something to do with the will, if I recall. "Oh, she's proud, but pride doesn't pay the bills, you know." At the post office, Miss Hartwell mentioned that Mr. Withers had been sending letters to London, private ones, under his own seal. "And you know what I think, Miss Marple? Blackmail." "That's what it was. Men like that always end up blackmailing someone." Miss Marple listened to each word with polite interest, her gloved hands folded neatly before her. But her mind was elsewhere, turning over fragments of silk, whispered quarrels, and a promise unpaid. By evening, the snow had deepened. She sat by her window, watching the lantern flicker through the storm. Somewhere in the stillness, a truth was beginning to form, delicate as frost and just as cold. Her maid entered quietly. "Shall I make more tea, ma'am?"
"No, thank you, Gladys."
"I think I've had quite enough tea for one day." The girl hesitated.
"Everyone's saying it was just bad luck, ma'am."
"Poor Mr. Withers slipping like that." Miss Marple's eyes, bright and steady, met hers. "Bad luck rarely brushes the snow quite so carefully from around a body, my dear." As Gladys retreated, the kettle began to whistle softly on the stove. Miss Marple rose to pour herself another cup after all, her movements slow, thoughtful. And as the kettle whistled, the narrator might have said, Miss Marple thought, "Promises have a dreadful way of coming due." Chapter 3. The Blue Silk Thread. Miss Hartwell at the post office had a way of whispering as though the stamps themselves were listening. "This morning," she whispered, before she even saw who had come in. "Such goings-on, Miss Marple, such goings-on," she murmured from behind the hatch, as if the walls had been expecting scandal and were now dutifully obliged. Miss Marple stepped in from the crisp air, tapping her boots lightly on the mat so as not to daub the old tiles with snow. She wore her plain winter coat and a small felt hat which had resisted fashion so successfully that it had come round again to a modest sort of acceptability. Her knitting rested in her bag, a tangible promise to look harmless. "Good morning, Miss Hartwell," she said in her mildest way. "I wonder if I might purchase a book of penny stamps. Oh, and the smallest packet twine, if you have it." "Certainly, certainly," the postmistress replied, hands dynamic among drawers and pigeonholes. Yet she could not resist another low aside. A surprising number of parcels to London this week, if one keeps count. People sending goodness knows what, and returning goodness knows why. "How industrious," Miss Marple murmured, eyes soft with interest. "Christmas has a way of putting us all in motion. I observe the village seems positively exercised by the lantern." "A terrible accident," Miss Hartwell said quickly, but her voice thinned on the last word, as a line of fishing wire does when it has snagged on a rock. "So sad." "The constable said it was simply a fall." Miss Marple smiled as one might at a child who has said something learned but not yet understood. "He did he? I suppose he's very sure of these things." The bell jangled faintly as a young girl slipped in, a maid from the Linton house, red-cheeked and brimming with emphasis. She bobbed a small curtsy to Miss Marple before leaning boldly across the counter. "That parcel for Mrs. Linton's niece, ma'am." "The blue one. Is it ready?" Miss Hartwell twitched. "Go along, Elsie. You'll be late for your duties." "But I saw it on the shelf yesterday," the girl persisted.
"The blue silk, oh."
She clapped a hand to her mouth, suddenly aware of having said too much in front of a lady whose hearing was more reliable than her own youth suspected. She retreated in a flurry of apology and went out again, the bell jangling her embarrassment in clear peals. Miss Marple did not look after her. She watched Miss Hartwell instead, the way the woman briskly rearranged items on the counter as though a tidy surface could sweep away an untidy fact. "Blue silk is very pretty at Christmas," Miss Marple observed gently. "I always think it looks best under lamplight." Miss Hartwell's smile showed too many teeth for comfort.
"Indeed, indeed."
"Will there be anything else, Miss Marple?" "Oh," Miss Marple considered. "I had meant to inquire. My great-niece wrote to say she admired a scarf she saw in a London window. Blue as a midsummer sky," she said. "I wondered whether one might order such a thing from here, if one were, perhaps, discreet." There was a beat of quiet. The stove ticked in the corner like a modest conscience. "People do order from London," Miss Hartwell allowed at last. "We are a modern village after all." "So we are," Miss Marple agreed. "And yet one sometimes uses a different name for such a treat, perhaps to avoid teasing at home."
"Oh yes, and sometimes one lets a friend collect it if her route is convenient." The postmistress's hands, still deft, grew a shade faster. "I wouldn't know about that." "Well now, you twine your stamps."
"Shall I put them in a little paper bag?" "If you are so kind." Miss Marple paid, then hesitated as though seized by a memory. Dear me, there was a small matter I wanted to ask you. A parcel arrived for one of the ladies yesterday afternoon, about the time the carols ended. I only ask because I noticed an envelope in the basket with a bold looping hand.
A very pretty script.
It reminded me of someone I know. Miss Hartwell's eyes flickered. Just a blink, quite ordinary. If one didn't notice the stillness that came with it, the sudden carefulness. We receive a great many hands, Miss Marple. Miss Marple's tone was amiable, her glance vague. This one had a habit of making the downstrokes rather firm and the tails rather long.
I always think it a youthful hand, hopeful.
It reminded me of the vicar's niece, Clara, if you know her writing. At Clara's name, the postmistress paled with such gentility that one might have blamed the stove for burning low. She cleared her throat.
I couldn't possibly say. How proper of you. Miss Marple smiled kindly.
They do say it is better to be proper than to be precise. A gust of wind rattled the door, and with it came the village doctor, stamping snow and whistling. Morning, Miss Hartwell. Miss Marple. He was full of fresh weather and cheerful ignorance. What's this I hear about a scarf from London? My wife will want one if it's true. He laughed, not seeing the small, strained set of the postmistress's mouth. Miss Marple, who never wasted a good distraction, turned to the doctor with polite enthusiasm.
How good of you to come out in such weather. One hears the road to Much Benham is treacherous. Nothing a stout set of tyres won't manage. Any news?
He threw it out carelessly, a fisherman's cast for a bite. Miss Hartwell busied herself with the ledger as if numbers could shield her. Only the usual, she said. Christmas cards.
A box of oranges for Mr. Barnes, if the lorry ever arrives. And some nonsense about a scarf. She spoke too quickly.
And it was not lost on Miss Marple that she failed to glance at the high shelf, where a slender, tissue-cocooned parcel lay with a provisional label tucked beneath. Gossip, obliging as ever. Obliged again when the doctor left. Mr. Pettigrew, the grocer, called from the doorway. Heard at the bakery that Mrs. Carroway was in tears yesterday. Something about a promise not kept. He chuckled awkwardly. You know how women are, do we? Miss Marple answered pleasantly, and Mr. Pettigrew, uncertain why he felt corrected, retreated with his cap in his hands. The shop grew quiet. Miss Marple drew out a postcard from her bag and studied it with an air of mild puzzlement. Such a nuisance, she said, not to Miss Hartwell so much as to the room, when one is entrusted with someone else's note and one fears the address might be wrong. One hesitates to deliver, you see, especially if the matter concerns a promise, which is often a delicate creature, silence stretched, thin as spun sugar. The postmistress fiddled with a pen, then put it down. She looked at last as if she had come to a little fence and had to choose whether to climb over or pretend it wasn't there.
I dare say, she said softly, that some promises are not meant to be written down. Miss Marple's eyes warmed.
Oh, quite. That is why people write them in a hand that is known only to friends. A tiny sound escaped Miss Hartwell, a stitched-up breath easing. You are very kind, Miss Marple. It is always kind to leave something in its proper drawer, Miss Marple murmured. Only one must be sure the drawer is the right one. She left shortly thereafter, twine and stamps tucked neatly away, and stepped back into the day, which had brightened in that watery way English winter does, as if light had been freshly laundered. Snow made a muff of the village's chatter, and yet the talk carried, as talk will. The maid from the Linton household, Elsie, had not gone straight back to her duties after all. Miss Marple saw her loitering by the green, confiding to a friend, I did see blue silk, I did, on the lantern frame itself the day before it happened. Just a whisper of it, like someone had tied a bit of ribbon and then thought better. The friend said that was likely nonsense, and Elsie insisted it wasn't, and in insisting, grew so pleased with her own daring that she forgot she had promised to be quick. Miss Marple strolled on, benign as a snowflake. Beneath the calm her mind ticked. Blue silk on the lantern, a parcel on a high shelf, a youthful hand with long tails, a widow's quarrel about a promise unpaid. She paused to admire the church notice board, mostly so that anyone watching would see a woman at leisure. but her glance slid to the lantern's iron collar where the snow had melted in a narrow crescent. A faint smudge remained, resin or wax, something sticky that had no reason to be there if merely a fall had occurred. A suspicious domestic clue, small enough to be swept away by evening, lingered now like the aftertaste of burnt sugar. At the vicarage path she met Clara coming out with a basket of hymn sheets. The girl's smile was composed, too composed, like a ribbon pulled tight.
"Miss Marple? Auntie sent me to deliver these." "How industrious," Miss Marple said, her tone as soft as the wool in her bag.
"You very tidy writing, Clara. I noticed it at the bazaar when you labelled the marmalade jars. Firm strokes, long tails, very pretty." Clara's gloved hand tightened on the basket handle. "It's only practice, Miss Marple. Practice makes patterns," Miss Marple said kindly, and let the rest hang like frost in the air. Clara coloured and, after a moment's pause, managed a small laugh. "You do notice everything," she said, half admiring, half uneasy. "Only what is set before me," Miss Marple replied, "and occasionally what is tucked too far behind." She nodded towards the churchyard. "You knew Mr. Withers, I think?" Everyone knew him. The words were correct. The tone was not. It had a wavering quality, as if Clara were feeling for a stepping stone in the dark.
He helped with the church accounts sometimes." "How useful."
"He kept many little sums in his head, I dare say." Miss Marple's eyes held the girl's for a breath longer than comfort allowed. Then she smiled and stepped aside. "Do give my regards to your aunt." She did not watch Clara go. She watched Clara's shadow, which hurried even when her feet did not. And she watched how, at the gate, the girl paused as though about to turn back, then thought better and kept on, shoulders just a little too straight. By afternoon, the village had a new morsel to chew. Mrs. Price at the dressmaker's was saying, of course a blue scarf was ordered.
"But not by who you think."
"People hide behind names when they don't wish to be teased." Mrs. Price did not say how she knew, which was mannerly of her, and not at all the point. Miss Marple returned past the post office one more time, ostensibly to post a card. Miss Hartwell glanced up and met her eyes, a meeting of polite shutters. She slid forward a small brown paper parcel to a lad from the dairy, made him sign a slip, and fussed with the ledger once more. Her voice, when she spoke to Miss Marple, was 2 shades too bright. "Did you find everything you needed, dear?" "Oh, yes," Miss Marple said, almost absently, as she affixed a stamp and smoothed it with a forefinger. "One's memory is quite helped by good penmanship." "It is a fine thing when a hand reveals such character." The postmistress's pen halted again for the briefest flicker, like a moth reconsidering a flame. The tremor that ran along her fingertips was small, but not invisible. Miss Marple, pretending not to see it, slid her card into the slot and offered the gentlest of nods. She spoke so pleasantly that it could not possibly have been a question. And it is always reassuring, isn't it, when, by the merest chance, one finds that a certain hand matches the vicar's niece to perfection. Miss Hartwell swallowed, colour ebbing and returning like surf. A second passed, then another, filled with the stove's faithful ticking and the faint scrape of snow against the door. Somewhere outside, children laughed and the sound seemed far away, and Miss Marple, pretending not to notice the tremor in the woman's voice, knew the web was tightening. Chapter 4. Shadows by the Firelight. Mrs. Price said, in that carrying whisper of hers that always arrived a moment before she did, that grief never stopped anyone from enjoying a good brandy. By the time she reached the door of the Three Sparrows, her remark had already floated ahead to the snug, where the evening's mourners were arranged in a fashion the good Lord might recognize from Sundays, solemn at first glance, eager at the second. The inn was warm with peat smoke and candlelight. The windows were misted where breath met winter glass. A log shifted on the hearth and tumbled sparks, and over the soft pop and sigh of the fire came a gentle tide of voices, each intent on appearing less interested than it truly was. Miss Marple had chosen a little chair near the hearth, not too close, for smoke clings to wool and she had a horror of lingering smells, but near enough that everyone forgot she was there. Her knitting needles clicked softly under the lamplight, a steady, companionable sound. Every so often she glanced up, and her sharp blue eyes, kind behind their spectacles, rested for an instant on a face, a hand, the rim of a glass, and then moved on. She appeared to be no more than a village gentlewoman whiling away the hour, and yet the room, without knowing why, kept volunteering its secrets. "Insurance money," murmured Mr. Pettigrew to Mr. Barnes, as if the words themselves were contraband. "On his life."
Mark me. His voice had that hushed relish people assume when they think their opinion is both shocking and correct. Mr. Barnes pretended to be scandalized.
"You don't say so." But the way he set his glass down too carefully, as though weighing it first, was a different kind of conversation. Missy Marple lifted her eyes long enough to notice that Mr. Barnes's cuffs bore a faint dusting of soot, not the honest smudge of a chimney-sweep's day, but the soft, silky drift one sees on the mantles of those who have been meddling with lamp fittings. It was too fine for a workman's grime, and too fresh to have come from this morning's fires. Her needles clicked on. At the bar, Mr. Roper, the innkeeper, polished glasses with a linen cloth that had known better years. "If you ask me," he said to no one in particular, which is to say to everyone, that lantern's wiring's been faulty for ages.
"I said so last Christmas and the one before."
"Told the vicar I did. It'll go out one night and there'll be a great to-do," I said. Mark my words, the vicar, who had the grace to blush at his own inattention, murmured that perhaps a committee might be formed to look into it. He tried to smile. It sat on his face like a borrowed hat. A hush fell for a moment as Mrs. Linton swept in, cheeks pink from the cold and from importance. She had dressed in her best evening cardigan, the one with the pearl buttons, and pinned to it a sprig of holly slightly too large for the occasion. "Such a sad, sad business," she announced, as though sadness had sent a note asking to be introduced. "But we must all bear up." She took a glass of brandy with a sigh that held more ceremony than sorrow, then added, lower and sweeter, "Of course one hears things. I don't like to repeat them." "Then don't," said Mrs. Price promptly, drawing her chair closer all the same. Miss Marple looked down at her knitting with a small, private smile. "There are moments when a stitch is as good as a nod. Only," Mrs. Linton continued, helpless before the duty of information, "only that Mr. Withers had been to see his man in Much Benham just last week. You know, papers and so on."
"A change," they said. She pressed her lips together in pious horror. "A will, if you can credit it. Changing a will at Christmastide."
It chills the blood. There was a stirring all round. Even the fire seemed to lean closer. The gossip settled at once into a shape that pleased it. Miss Marple did not look up, but she marked how the word will ran about the room like a small animal men chase without admitting they are chasing. Mr. Barnes's
hand tightened on the stem of his glass. Mr. Pettigrew
developed a cough that required a great deal of attention. The vicar's niece, Clara, quiet in a corner, her coat still on as if she had not planned to stay, flinched as though a draught had found her specifically. It was a small change, the sort that would have gone unnoticed if one were not already listening. A young maid, Elsie, from the Linton house, sidled near Miss Marple with a plate of seed cake and a conspirator's delight. "Heard it myself," she breathed, setting the plate on the little table. "Mrs. Linton says the solicitor sent a note day before yesterday.
Special delivery."
She saw the envelope. Thick paper, cream, smelt of something posh. "How clever of her," Miss Marple said gently, and offered the girl a slice. "Seed cake makes the truth kinder, I always think." Elsie giggled and hurried away, her satisfaction warming the room like a second fire. The door opened to admit Dr. Hayward, who brought a gust of cold air and professional gravity. He shook the snow from his coat and came to the hearth.
"Evening," he said, and then with the air of one dismissing a tiresome rumour, Constable maintained it's a fall.
"I must say there's nothing to contradict him at first sight." "At first sight?" Miss Marple repeated amiably. "First sights are such obliging things. They will tell one almost anything one asks." The doctor had the grace to laugh. You'll have us all doubting our own eyes, Miss Marple. Not at all, dear Doctor.
Only asking them to blink now and then. Mr. Roper clattered 2 fresh glasses onto a tray, his cloth describing hurried circles.
As he turned, Miss Marple caught the faintest smear of wax along the base of one of the brandy glasses, as though a candle had wept on it, and the tear not quite been removed. A domestic clue, very small, but she filed it away alongside the soot on Mr. Barnes's cuffs and the talk of faulty wiring. Wax, soot, wiring. 3 friends seldom found together unless someone had made their acquaintance. From the settle by the window, old Mr. Coles, who had once kept a watchmaker's shop and now had little to do but observe other people's time, spoke up with creaking authority. Will or no will, Henry Withers kept a ledger in his head, he did. Never forgot a shilling owed him. That sort of accuracy isn't natural in a friendly man, he coughed, satisfied with the sound of his own clarity. Friendly men, murmured Miss Marple,
are rarely remembered for their accounts. Clara rose as if to go.
Then reconsidering, sank back with a faint rustle of her skirt. The movement tugged at Miss Marple's attention. The girl's face had the washed-out look of one who has spent her worry early in the day and must now go on credit. When the vicar touched her sleeve, she started and smiled too brightly. A girl's brightness, Miss Marple knew, is often a kind of shade. Mrs. Linton, meanwhile, had installed herself at the near end of the bar and was dispensing sympathies which had an unfortunate way of becoming questions. Of course it's not our place, she told Mr. Barnes, but one wonders who benefits. Such matters weigh upon a person, you know. We must think of the future of the village. Mr. Barnes attempted a chuckle and failed. No doubt his relations, he said. If he had any. Oh, he had relations, Mrs. Price put in, focused as a needle. Second cousin somewhere beyond Much Benham.
And there's Mrs. Carroway. No relation, of course, but some connection.
The way he spoke to her last week, sharp as vinegar, they say. Promises, that was the word. A promise unpaid. At this, the tone of the room altered by a fraction, like a picture frame tilted half an inch. Even the fire seemed to draw its breath differently. Miss Marple's needles paused mid-click and then resumed, as steady as a heartbeat.
Promises again.
The same word from a different mouth acquires a second meaning, she reflected, and 2 meanings, with care, can be coaxed into a third. She contrived, as she so often did, to be spoken to without appearing to invite it. Terrible loss, Mr. Roper said, leaning in to replace a candle on the mantel. Still, these things come sudden. That lantern? Faulty, mark me. His voice had the careful casualness of a man setting a plate and listening for the break. Perhaps, Miss Marple said kindly, and watched the new candle catch, the flame flaring before it settled. Fresh wick, new wax, purchased today, she suspected, by the faint scent that clung to it. She glanced back to Mr. Barnes's cuffs and saw, with quiet satisfaction, a pale, tacky gleam at the hem, the kind candle wax leaves when hurried hands brushed too close. Your sleeve, she said, a grandmother's mild concern. You've been very near the fire. Barnes started, glanced down, and rubbed at the speck as if it personally accused him.
Clumsy of me, he muttered, a fraction too loud,
and found something urgent to discuss with Mr. Pettigrew at once. Later, when the brandy had loosened everybody's tongues and tightened nobody's sense, the talk returned to the will. I heard from Nora at the post, Mrs. Price said, with the confidence of one in the right seat at the right time, that a thick envelope went to Withers from Mr. Fell. He's the solicitor. Just 2 days ago, Mr. Fell never writes unless there's something that wants signing. Changing his mind at Christmas, Mr. Coles said darkly. Nothing good comes of a pen in winter. Miss Marple's gaze went for a moment to Clara, who had gone pale again at the solicitor's name and pressed her lips together in a way that made a white line. The vicar reached for her hand fatherly, and she withdrew it after a heartbeat too long, as though remembering to. A subtle shift, small as a single stitch, dropped and caught again, yet once seen, impossible to forget. As the hour grew comfortable and then unsteady, Miss Marple folded her knitting and tucked it away. She stood, smoothing her skirt, and delivered a few soft words of condolence to those who wished to hear themselves praised for their feeling. On her way to the door, she paused by the hearth to warm her hands. There, in the ash at the edge of the grate, she noted a curled scrap of brown paper, torn from a parcel's wrapping by the look of it, with the faint ghost of a pencilled name rubbed nearly away. The letters might once have been C-la, only someone had thought better of leaving them whole. She did not stoop to rescue the scrap. It is sometimes good to let evidence believe it has hidden itself. The night greeted her with a clean breath. Across the green, the winter lantern glimmered, steady and very innocent, the way a cat looks after it has tipped the cream. Behind her, the door of the inn swung to and then back on its hinges, admitting one more gust of talk about wiring and wills and brandy that warms nothing essential. Miss Marple drew her scarf a shade tighter. She had seen soot where there ought to have been none, wax where only glass should shine, and heard a village discuss an accident as though it were a ledger to be balanced. The deceased had changed his will. This, people said, as if it were a candle anyone might snuff and relight. Some were too eager to tell the tale. Some were too careful not to. A spark popped in the hearth behind her as the log settled its argument with the flame, and as the fire crackled, Miss Marple thought that greed, like smoke, always finds its way through the smallest cracks. Chapter 5. The Garden Gate. At daybreak, when the whole village looked as though it had been dusted with icing sugar, Mrs. Price was heard to declare to the milkman that widows who took walks at odd hours were either courting chills or courting trouble. The remark hung over St. Mary Mead like a thin skein of frost, and by the time Miss Marple set out with a small bouquet of winter jasmine and privet berries on her arm, the words had travelled before her, arriving at Mrs. Carroway's cottage a good minute ahead of her knock. The garden gate, a pretty little white thing with an old-fashioned latch, stuck for half a second before yielding. In that small hesitation, Miss Marple saw something that did not belong. Half buried in the crisp glitter of frost lay a single glove, pale kidskin, the sort of glove a careful girl might save for best. Its edge was torn in a way that suggested haste rather than wear, and a dusting of delicate crystals clung to the seams. Miss Marple's gloved hand hovered, then turned the glove very lightly with one fingertip. A faint impression of initials showed at the cuff, letters pressed long ago by a proper shop, C.W. She let the gate latch fall with a modest click and walked up the path as if she had noticed nothing at all. Her bouquet looked very cheerful against the pale day. She held it in both hands like an apology. Mrs. Carroway opened the door at once, which told Miss Marple two things: that the widow had been listening for visitors, and that she had not slept much. The woman's eyes, dark and fine as wet ink, darted over Miss Marple's shoulder to the lane, and then back again. "Miss Marple," she said, and could not quite keep the relief from her voice. "How kind one tries," Miss Marple murmured, stepping into the small front room. It was neat in the way that comes of anxiety rather than temper. Everything placed squarely, coals raked a touch too frequently, the kettle set with anticipatory precision on the hob. A faint smell of lavender fought with the colder scent that winter brings in on boots, the scent of the lane. Miss Marple's eyes touched the little table, where a cup had left a damp ring and been wiped at once, not quite thoroughly, leaving a ghost circle behind. "I brought you some winter jasmine," Miss Marple said, arranging the bouquet with a gentle fuss at the mantel. "It always struck me as the bravest of small flowers." "How sweet of you," said Mrs. Carroway, and her gaze flicked to the window again.
"People talk, you know." "They do," agreed Miss Marple. "It keeps the village warm." They sat.
The kettle sang. Mrs. Carroway's fingers, elegant and perhaps once more accustomed to music than to housework, shook as she poured.
They say he slipped," she ventured, eyes on the tea rather than on Miss Marple.
"A lantern, perhaps. Light can be treacherous, can't it?"
"It makes one think the ground is nearer than it is." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly in her bag. a homely little heartbeat.
Light generally shows more than it deceives, she said mildly. It reveals. That is sometimes more treacherous to us than any dimness. The widow looked up sharply, then down again. She placed the sugar tongs with unnecessary care, aligning them to the tray as if alignment might deliver safety. People say, "So many things," she added, her tone reaching for calm and failing to find it. From outside came the cautious crunch of a passer-by, followed by a voice as slender and eager as a needle. Mrs. Linton's maid Elsie was confiding to a friend at the hedge.
"I tell you, I saw someone leave here, near midnight it was, carrying a lantern. I wasn't spying, I was returning the pudding basin and oh—"
"Mind your voice," hissed the friend. "Do you want the village to hear?" "The village already knows," Elsie returned, triumphant in whisper. Mrs. Carroway flinched. It was a tiny movement, no more than a ripple at the corner of her mouth, but Miss Marple felt it through the room like the first tremor under a winter pond. "Shall I close the window, my dear?" Miss Marple asked, as if she had not heard a syllable. "No?" "Yes," said Mrs. Carroway, and then coloured.
"Oh, I'm sorry."
"I don't seem quite myself." Miss Marple closed the window with an easy hand, noticing as she did so the powdery smear of frost that had been brushed from the sill on the inside. Someone had leaned out, or in, recently. On the floor by the door, the faintest scratch of mud had been rubbed away by a damp cloth, a conscientious effort, but not a perfect one. And near the hearth, on a chair back, a single silk thread, blue, too bright for this sober cottage, clung as if reluctant to depart. "Mrs. Price says widows who walk late are courting colds," Miss Marple offered, pouring a little more tea. It was presented like gossip, tossed into the air with no more weight than a snowflake. "I did not walk," Mrs. Carroway said quickly, and then, hearing herself, slowed her breath.
I scarcely slept. I cannot abide the night since my husband's passing."
"Lamps make me feel less alone." "How sensible," Miss Marple said, as if she had been told of an extra shawl fetched for an old aunt. Her eyes did not leave Mrs. Carroway's face. The woman's voice had changed on the word lamps, softening with a fondness that did not belong to the object. Lamps were comfort and concealment both, Miss Marple considered. They cast circles of safety that left the edges darker. From the path came another footfall and a rap at the door. Mrs. Pratt from the next cottage peered in without quite entering. A neighbour's compromise. "Just brought back your pie tin, Mrs. Carroway. My Bert says to tell you he saw a light moving down your path last night. Might have been you, might have been a visitor. He's not one to pry." She waited an instant to be invited into more. "How considerate of Bert," Miss Marple said, before Mrs. Carroway could answer. "The lane was lively then?" "Lively," Mrs. Pratt sniffed. "If you call creeping about lively. Well, we all have our reasons at Christmas." She set the tin down on the sideboard and allowed herself a glance at Miss Marple.
"Oh, I say, what a pretty glove at your gate."
"Wouldn't be mine, would it? No, mine's a dreadful brown. This one's quality." She smacked her lips softly over the last word and went away with the air of a woman who'd succeeded in dropping a plum into a pie without cracking the crust. Miss Marple waited a moment.
"A glove?"
she said gently. Mrs. Carroway rose at once, too quickly. "I'll fetch it." She went out and Miss Marple counted 10 quiet seconds before following. The garden had the listening silence of early morning. Each fence post wore its white cap. Mrs. Carroway stood by the gate, the glove in her hand like a bird she had not meant to catch. "What a pretty thing," Miss Marple said. "I remember a shop in Much Benham that stamped initials, so handy when one has a crowd at a tea and gloves go wandering." She turned her head as if to admire the hedge, and in doing so saw the cuff clearly. C.W. impressed with neat authority. "So many Claras and Charlottes and—" "Oh, I suppose one might belong to a Miss Whitby if the world were disposed to be literal." Mrs. Carroway's fingers tightened.
"It was left here," she said.
"I don't know by whom. How awkward gloves are," Miss Marple murmured, as if sympathizing with the item. "Always going astray. They require a certain youth to keep them, I think." Back indoors the room seemed smaller. The widow set the glove on the mantel, and in that simple gesture betrayed she wanted to put the matter out of reach. Her voice, when she spoke, was too smooth. I suppose Clara Whitby might have called. The vicar is fond of sending her with messages. Such a helpful girl, Miss Marple said agreeably. She delivered hymn sheets just yesterday and bore herself bravely. She let the word, bravely, sit and look at them both. Mrs. Carroway's gaze fled to the jasmine.
I don't. She stopped, swallowed and tried again.
What is it you want of me, Miss Marple? Oh, nothing at all, Miss Marple said in a tone as mild as warm milk. Only to be certain you have company when you wish it, and to say that I have known gloves to be torn when a gate catches at them, especially if the hand is moving rather quickly. Garden latches have personalities. Yours is slightly jealous of sleeves. A small, unwilling smile flickered across the widow's face and went out. You see too much, she whispered. I see enough, said Miss Marple, rising to look at the mantel as if arranging the flowers required close study. She glanced at the glove, at the blue silk thread on the chair back, at the ghost ring of a cup, at the faint smear of wax on the inside of the window latch where a candle had been set and moved. When people are frightened, they tidy. It is very understandable. Tidying is a way of believing things can be put back. The kettle clicked off. Neither woman reached for it. There came another shuffle at the hedge, and Mrs. Pratt's voice, now in conversation with someone else, floated in.
Lantern, I tell you.
Brass handle, just so.
I saw the glint as they turned.
That's not a candle in a jar, that's a proper lantern, a woman, asked the other voice, slow and sceptical. A figure, Mrs. Pratt allowed, and made it sound like a verdict. Mrs. Carroway closed her eyes. Her hands, elegant and trembling, found the edge of the table and held on. When she opened them again, she had a formal calm ready for Miss Marple. You think badly of me, she said. I try not to think badly of anyone, Miss Marple replied, kindness itself. But I notice when people are not thinking kindly of themselves. Something in that sentence softened the widow. She sat, and when she spoke again her tone had changed. It lowered, not to confide, but to admit the shape of a feeling.
There was a promise, she said.
He spoke of it as if it belonged to him. Perhaps it did. But promises are made on one day and judged on another, and the weather is not always the same. Miss Marple did not answer. She did not need to. The room answered for her. The wax trace on the latch, the blue thread, the glove on the mantel, with letters that might as well have been a bell. They moved at last to the door. The garden waited, composed and pale, and the gate creaked a little as gates do when they have seen more than they wish. Miss Marple reached out to steady a spray of jasmine in the bouquet. A few flakes had settled there, tiny white stars on yellow. She brushed them away very gently and looked down at the snow patterned by footprints, the crisp edges of leaving and the softer edges of returning. And Miss Marple, brushing snow from the petals, felt that beneath the garden's quiet lay a tangle of guilt. Chapter 6. The confession that wasn't the village, as everyone agreed, always took on a peculiar brightness when someone from London arrived. That morning it was Inspector Craddock who brought the gleam, his polished shoes, his brisk voice, and the faint but unmistakable scent of superiority that so often accompanied city men when they visited St. Mary Mead. He stood in the vicarage drawing-room, hat under one arm, notebook in the other, explaining with professional cheer that the entire affair was quite straightforward. Robbery gone wrong, he said confidently, tapping the pencil against his notes. The deceased must have interrupted the thief. A tussle, a fall, and there you have it. Nothing more to it. Miss Marple, seated neatly in a corner chair, was engaged in what appeared to be counting stitches, though anyone who knew her would have suspected the needles were moving mostly by habit. So neat, she murmured, as though speaking to the wool. So terribly neat. The inspector looked up. I beg your pardon, ma'am?
Only, Miss Marple said, without lifting her eyes, that accidents rarely tidy up after themselves.
I find it curious when they do. Mrs. Weatherby, the vicar's wife, chose that moment to appear with a tray of tea, far too quickly, Miss Marple noted, for someone who had only just been told the inspector wanted refreshment. Clearly she had been listening from the passage. Milk and sugar? The inspector asked politely, taking a cup. Just a drop. Miss Marple said. "I always find too much milk rather dulls the flavour. A pity to have one's tea tell one nothing." The inspector smiled indulgently, though his eyes were already turning back to his notes. Outside the vicarage window, the day hung pale and still. The churchyard, with its frost-bound hedges and quiet graves, looked as peaceful as ever. And yet Miss Marple, watching the breath of a robin on the sill, thought that peace could sometimes be the most deceptive thing in the world. Craddock was continuing. "We found the deceased's wallet missing. Stands to reason the motive was theft. These sorts of opportunists strike quickly. Probably a stranger passing through. Strangers are very convenient," Miss Marple said softly, as if reflecting on the comfort of a good overcoat. "They seldom argue back." The vicar looked uneasy. "Surely you don't mean—" "My dear vicar," said Miss Marple, "I mean only that in villages one finds very few strangers.
And when something unpleasant occurs, it is generally one of us who tidies it away before the police arrive." There was a pause.
The inspector made a small sound that might have been a laugh, or irritation disguised as one. "We'll keep an open mind, of course," he said briskly. "Oh, do," Miss Marple replied gently. A knock came at the door then, and Clara Whitby entered, white-faced, clutching her shawl. "Inspector," she said tremulously, "I heard you wanted to ask me about the letters." "Letters," Craddock repeated, turning sharp. Miss Marple's needles paused, then resumed their gentle rhythm.
"Ah, yes," she murmured.
"Such troublesome little things, letters. So revealing when not meant to be, and so confusing when one tries too hard to be discreet." Clara blushed fiercely. "It's not what people think," she said. "Mr. Withers only asked me to post something for him."
"I didn't read it."
Her voice trembled. Mrs. Weatherby tutted softly. "Now, my dear But Miss Marple's eyes, very mild, very blue, stayed on Clara. She noticed the girl's hands twisting the edge of her shawl, the knuckles pale against the wool.
Guilt did not always look like guilt.
Sometimes it was simply fear wearing its best clothes. "Letters can be so inconvenient," Miss Marple said kindly, "especially when they are returned unopened. I always think paper has a conscience of its own. It never quite stays where it's not wanted." Clara's lip quivered.
"You don't think I—" "My dear," said Miss Marple, "I think only that you are frightened."
"Of what, I couldn't say yet," the inspector interrupted, notebook poised. "We'll take your statement later, Miss Whitby."
Nothing to worry about, but Clara didn't look reassured.
She nodded mutely and hurried from the room, her footsteps unsteady on the hall rug. When the door closed, the vicar sighed. "She's a good girl, really. Sensitive, takes things to heart." "Indeed," said Miss Marple, winding her yarn carefully. "That's often the trouble with good people. They notice what they oughtn't." A silence settled, and in it came the faint sound of the church clock marking the half-hour. The inspector flipped a page. "We found no new physical evidence apart from some wax traces and soot near the body. Could have been from the lantern, of course. These things spread easily. Lantern soot is very coarse," Miss Marple observed, "whereas what you describe sounds fine, powdery like smoke from a domestic hearth. I wonder where he might have been before he died." The inspector hesitated. "Well, we did search the nearby properties." "And the vicarage?" He frowned.
"Yes, naturally."
"Though nothing of note?" Mrs. Weatherby gave a nervous laugh. "Except, of course, the curtain we had to mend." "Really, it was silly of me. I caught it on the fire screen last week."
A dreadful tear.
"Clara stitched it beautifully, though. She's a clever hand with a needle." Miss Marple's head lifted slightly.
"How fortunate," she said.
"Blue silk, wasn't it?" "Yes. Faded a little, but quite striking in its day." "Striking enough," Miss Marple murmured, "to be remembered when one sees it elsewhere." The inspector glanced between them. "You mean the silk fragment? The one found in the victim's hand?"
"I mean nothing at all," said Miss Marple pleasantly.
"Merely that fabrics do tend to travel more than one expects. Curtains, for instance, are very sociable." Mrs. Weatherby looked puzzled. The inspector looked unconvinced. Miss Marple, who seldom pressed her point, let the silence do the talking for her. It was Mr. Pettigrew, arriving with a fresh round of gossip, who next shifted the air. "You'll never believe it," he told the room, puffed up with urgency. "They've found the dead man's wallet behind the vicarage hedge of all places, quite untouched except for a smear of frost. The constable says it must have been thrown there in panic. Miss Marple smiled faintly. How thoughtful of Panic to throw things so neatly.
Most people drop them. Inspector Craddock's brows knit. You think it was planted?
I think, said Miss Marple, that whoever placed it wished to be believed. That's a dangerous sort of wishing. Pettigrew lingered, basking in his importance. It's all anyone's talking about at the Green. Poor Clara's beside herself. They say she went white as a sheet when she heard. Poor Clara, Miss Marple repeated softly. Mrs. Weatherby wrung her hands.
You don't suppose she— No, said Miss Marple firmly.
But I do suppose she saw something that made her afraid. That evening, the inspector took his leave, promising to have the area searched again at dawn. The vicar, looking rather grey, accompanied him to the door, while Mrs. Weatherby fretted over whether to reheat the soup. Miss Marple lingered by the fire, her knitting forgotten on her lap. The flames caught the folds of the blue curtain beside her, turning it momentarily into a wavering sea of colour. She looked at the careful mending Clara's fine, tidy stitching and thought of the silk fragment found in the dead man's hand, torn roughly, the same faded hue. When Mrs. Weatherby returned, she found Miss Marple studying the curtain with that
absent-minded expression that meant.
Her thoughts were far ahead of her words. You've gone quite—
Quiet, said the vicar's wife nervously. Yes, said Miss Marple.
I was only thinking how often mending covers more than it reveals. The trick, I find, is to look at what was torn, not at what was fixed. The fire crackled. Somewhere in the house, Clara was crying softly. Miss Marple did not move to comfort her. Instead, she folded her knitting with a sigh, a gentle, weary sound that might have been mistaken for pity, but wasn't, because Miss Marple, with a gentle sigh, thought that some lies are stitched from desperation.
Not malice. Chapter 7. The Whisper in the Snow. The first person to notice the new snow that morning was Mrs. Price, who announced to the baker's boy,
It's falling thicker than forgiveness, and as usual, she wasn't far wrong. St. Mary Mead lay wrapped in white, quiet, soft, deceptive. The sort of silence, Miss Marple thought, that often comes when people have decided not to speak of something rather important. She walked carefully along the lane from the vicarage, her walking stick tapping gently at the edge of the path, the air misting faintly around her breath. Each cottage she passed looked innocent enough, but she knew innocence was rarely found in clusters. Curtains shifted. Heads turned away a second too late. The village had begun to close its shutters against more than just the cold. The constable, with his scarf wound too tightly, nodded as she passed. Still snowing, ma'am? Be a bad night for the lantern if it keeps up. Oh, I imagine it's weathered worse, Miss Marple said mildly, though her eyes were already on the churchyard ahead. The winter lantern hung there still, its golden light diffused in the falling snow like honey stirred into milk. Beneath it, faint shadows lingered, old ones, and one very new. She paused at the gate, the same gate through which so many had come the night of the carols. The hinges creaked softly, a small, familiar complaint. Her gaze fell to the ground. The first thing she noticed was that not all the snow was fresh. Beneath the clean surface lay ridges, older footprints, softened by the first fall and pressed again by the second. Two sets, distinct enough to read, one heavy, with deep, square edges, the other light and smaller, crossing the first. She bent, gloved fingers brushing the cold crust of snow.
Curious, she murmured almost to herself.
One seldom goes toward a body after it's found. Behind her, the faint shuffle of boots made her straighten. It was Mr. Barnes, the grocer, who had made a valiant attempt at solemnity, but failed to disguise the gleam of curiosity in his eyes. Morning, Miss Marple.
Couldn't keep away, could you? Terrible business, though they say it's all but solved. Do they?
Miss Marple's tone was polite, but the word they always interested her more than the news it carried. And what have they decided today? Robbery, same as before. But between us, ma'am, there's talk he wasn't just a clerk. Kept accounts for other people, if you take my meaning, Miss Marple did. In St. Mary Mead, accounts could mean many things. Mrs. Linton says he lent money.
At interest, Barnes continued, lowering his voice as though the dead might overhear.
Some say he threatened folk who didn't pay.
Had letters, she says.
Private ones. People don't like being reminded of debts. No, Miss Marple agreed softly. And I suppose one pays them one way or another. Barnes gave a hasty nod and departed, no doubt to make sure the same remark reached the next listener with suitable embellishment. Miss Marple turned back to the footprints. The larger pair came from the lane, Mr. Withers's shoes, she guessed. The smaller ones crossed from the direction of the vicarage gate, pausing near the lantern, circling slightly, and ending where the body had fallen. There were no prints leading away. She looked up at the old lamp itself, its flames steady now after so many nights of flickering. It had been cleaned recently, too recently. The brass was polished bright, almost shining through the snow. Someone had made quite sure it looked innocent. A voice drifted from behind her, cutting the quiet. He shouldn't have gone near that lantern again. Mrs. Linton had appeared, swathed in furs, her nose red from the cold, and her expression rich with uninvited knowledge. Again? Miss Marple said gently. Mrs. Linton hesitated, rearranging her gloves with a briskness that betrayed guilt of some kind, if not of deed, then of speech.
Oh, I only meant, well, he was forever fiddling with it.
The vicar trusted him with the key to the churchyard shed. Always repairing, so he said.
Fuses, wires, lamps, whatever excuse suited him.
He liked having the run of the place, that one.
Too much by half. Miss Marple's eyes flicked briefly to the iron hook beneath the lantern, where a small scorch mark lingered, a burn not from wax, but from a short, sharp flare of electricity.
So he liked to keep things bright, she said thoughtfully. That explains a great deal. Mrs. Linton looked puzzled, but before she could ask what, the church bell struck 11, echoing across the village. They both turned instinctively toward the church tower. Its stone half vanished in the falling snow. Odd, said Mrs. Linton. That sound gives me chills.
And yet I've heard it every day for 40 years. Perhaps because it tolls for more than time, Miss Marple replied softly. The older woman made her excuses soon after,
muttering something about bread rising, and bustled off toward the village. Miss Marple stayed where she was, the bell's fading resonance mingling with the whisper of snow. She stooped again near the prints, following the smaller set until they reached the low wall by the lantern post. There she found a patch of disturbed earth beneath the snow. Her gloved fingers brushed away the crust, revealing a scattering of black ash, burned paper, brittle and fine. She lifted a piece, and a single letter survived among the charred fragments, the looping tail of an M.
Elegant, unmistakably written by someone used to fine stationery. Burned.
And badly, Miss Marple murmured, as though done in a hurry. Yet he was found here, quite calmly laid out. When she rose, Inspector Craddock was crossing the green toward her, his coat collar turned up against the wind.
Miss Marple!
I might have known you'd be here before me.
You'll catch your death in this weather. Thank you, Inspector, but I find the cold rather invigorating when one's thoughts need clearing. He smiled thinly.
I'm not sure my sergeant would call this thinking weather. More like freezing weather. Perhaps, she said, but sometimes a frozen thing holds its shape better than a melting one. Craddock glanced down at her find.
Ashes from what? Paper, I believe.
Personal papers. He seems to have been a man of, shall we say, many correspondences. That's one way to put it, said Craddock grimly. We found a few unsent letters in his room. Demand notes, threats, half of them signed only with initials. He was blackmailing them all by the looks of it. Half the village. At least, Miss Marple nodded once, as if confirming a suspicion long held. Then no wonder everyone looked so terribly respectable this week. The inspector laughed despite himself. You have a way of putting things, Miss Marple. Still, blackmail gives us motive enough for any number of people. Too many, she said gently. And yet I think it isn't money that explains this one. Not quite. Oh? She pointed with her stick to the second set of prints. Those were made after his death. See how the heel presses into the older snow without the depth of a man's full weight. Someone came back to take something or to make something look right. Craddock followed her gaze, and for once his brisk certainty faltered. You think the scene was arranged? I think, Miss Marple said, that someone in this village has a very tidy mind indeed." They stood in silence for a moment, watching the snow fall gently over the prints, softening them back into anonymity. "Tell me," said Miss Marple, "did you ever look at the lantern itself?" He blinked. "The lantern?"
"No reason to. Why?"
"Because the truth," she said, "has a way of hiding in plain sight, and sometimes light, if one looks closely, reveals more than it was ever meant to." The inspector looked as though he might protest, but Miss Marple was already walking away, her steps slow but sure, her stick tapping lightly against the frozen path. Behind her, the church bells began to toll for noon, their deep voices rolling across the snow-laden roofs. The sound seemed to hang in the still air long after the clappers fell silent. Miss Marple paused at the edge of the green and looked back at the lantern's glow. It wavered briefly, like a heartbeat under glass, and as the church bells tolled, Miss Marple knew the lantern hadn't just lit the night, it had illuminated a secret, meant to stay buried. Chapter 8. Beneath the winter lantern. It began, as many evenings in St. Mary Mead did, with a hush that carried more meaning than any noise could. The winter lantern, newly polished and burning low, sent soft ripples of light across the snow. Each flake seemed to pause in mid-air, listening. Inside the church hall, the long table had been cleared of hymn sheets and replaced with steaming cups of tea. Yet there was a stiffness in the air, a kind of expectant quiet, as though everyone present knew they were not there for comfort. Mrs. Linton sat nearest the lantern's glow, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She had worn black again, though it was not required, and her pearls gleamed faintly against her collarbone like a string of pale confessions. The vicar stood near the door, looking deeply uncomfortable, while Clara Whitby sat beside him, eyes fixed on her folded handkerchief. Mrs. Carroway, pale but composed, was seated by the fire, her gaze low, her grief as neat as her gloves. At the head of the table, knitting needles resting idle beside her, sat Miss Marple. Inspector Craddock had arrived late from the station, dusted with snow and looking more harried than authoritative.
A final meeting, he'd called it, in that brisk London tone that village folk tolerated rather than admired.
But Miss Marple's invitation had been the real summons, and somehow none had refused. She began without ceremony. "I believe," she said gently, "that we can now put the lantern and poor Mr. Withers to rest." Her tone was mild, even comforting, but the sentence landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Every face turned toward her. The fire popped. A spoon clinked faintly against porcelain. Craddock, notebook in hand, raised an eyebrow. "You found something, Miss Marple?" "Oh, not found," she replied almost cheerfully. "Merely noticed what has been here all along. You see, truth is rather like snow. It settles quietly at first, but eventually covers everything." Mrs. Linton gave a sharp little laugh, the kind that escapes before it's meant to. "My dear Miss Marple, you do speak so poetically. But surely you can't mean to suggest this was anything other than a tragic accident?" Miss Marple's smile was soft and sad. "Oh, but I can, Mrs. Linton, and I do." The silence deepened. "You see," she continued, "poor Mr. Withers was not the unfortunate victim of chance, nor of panic, nor even of greed. He was murdered deliberately and very cleverly too."
"Only it wasn't by the obvious hands," she let the words settle.
Knitting a few calm rows before looking up again. "Everyone thought first of Mrs. Carroway," Miss Marple went on, "because grief and gossip are such easy companions. But Mrs. Carroway's fear was not of guilt, it was of being found in the wrong place at the wrong time. Her lantern, as it turns out, had nothing to do with his death at all." Mrs. Carroway looked up, eyes wide and glistening.
"You believe me, then?"
"Oh, I never disbelieved you," said Miss Marple kindly. "You see, your footprints stopped where fear began. That's quite different from murder." Craddock leaned forward. "Then what of the glove?" "The initials, C.W. Surely they implicate Miss Whitby?" Clara's breath caught audibly. Miss Marple nodded. "Indeed they might have, if not for the fact that the glove was dropped before the murder took place. Miss Whitby visited Mrs. Carroway earlier that evening, you see, returning some hymn sheets. She tore her glove on the garden gate, and left it behind quite innocently.
Only someone later thought it might be useful, an excellent red herring to distract from their own trouble. The vicar, who had been fidgeting with his handkerchief, looked stricken. Then who?
Miss Marple turned her gaze upon Mrs. Linton. It was not unkind, that gaze, but it was steady, unwavering in the way only the very gentle can be. Mrs. Linton's smile faltered. "You cannot mean me," she said faintly.
My dear Miss Marple, what possible reason? Oh, my dear, said Miss Marple softly, you have always been a woman of causes.
The church bazaar, the temperance society, the winter charity fund. So many good works. But good works can sometimes hide other purposes, can't they? Mrs. Linton's fingers twitched against the table.
I don't know what you mean. Of course you do, Miss Marple said, her voice gentle as falling snow.
The charity fund accounts. You were treasurer, and poor Mr. Withers was your bookkeeper. He found irregularities. Not large sums, oh no, just small adjustments, easily overlooked. Enough to help a son in difficulty, perhaps. The inspector's pencil froze mid-note. Miss Marple's words flowed on quietly, every syllable light, measured, merciful. Your son, Arthur, was dismissed from his position in London for embezzlement some years ago, wasn't he? Mr. Withers was the one who uncovered it. You appealed to him, begged him to stay silent, and he did, for a time. But men like Mr. Withers seldom forget their power. He returned to St. Mary Mead and began to use it. Mrs. Linton's complexion had drained to the shade of her pearls.
That's absurd. Malicious gossip.
No gossip, Miss Marple said. Facts, I'm afraid. He threatened to expose you once more, this time for your creative handling of the fund. And you, being a mother first and a treasurer second, could not bear to see your family's disgrace repeated. Craddock spoke, low and certain. The poison? Yes, said Miss Marple. In his brandy at their little meeting by the lantern?
He thought you'd come to plead again.
You came to end it. The silk fragment in his hand was not from Mrs. Carroway's scarf, nor from Clara's mending. It was from your own handkerchief, the one you used to wipe the cup. Mrs. Linton's lips parted. He was coughing, she whispered.
I thought it was justice. No one spoke.
Even the fire had grown still. At last Miss Marple said, Justice and revenge do look terribly alike in candlelight. Mrs. Linton's trembling hands, long a subject of village sympathy, rested motionless now upon the table. The tremor was gone. It had never been nerves, Miss Marple realized. It had been guilt all along, wearing its gentlest disguise. The inspector rose slowly, his duty grim but clear. Mrs. Linton, I'm afraid you'll have to come with me. She nodded, almost serenely. I suppose I shall. I only ever meant to protect what was left of him, of Arthur. Miss Marple's eyes softened. Yes, we mothers often mean well. It's just that meaning well can be such dangerous business. The door closed behind them. The silence that followed was heavy, but not cruel. Mrs. Carroway wept quietly into her handkerchief. Clara reached out, tentative, and Miss Marple patted her hand with a small, steady smile. Outside, the lantern flickered once, then steadied again, its flame a fragile, faithful thing in the falling snow. The light spilled gently over the path, over the footprints that would soon vanish, and over Miss Marple as she stood by the window, watching. The vicar cleared his throat softly behind her.
You've brought peace back to us, Miss Marple. She shook her head, her voice no louder than the whisper of snow against glass.
Peace, yes, but only for a time.
It never lingers long, not here. And as the lantern's light faded into the soft snow, Miss Marple quietly folded her gloves.
In St. Mary Mead, the winter would be peaceful once more, though peace, as she well knew, never lingered for long. Candlelight mystery, message, and so, beneath the quiet hush of falling snow, the village of St. Mary Mead found its calm again. The winter lantern still burned each night, steady, golden, and deceptively innocent, casting its glow across the churchyard where truth had been laid bare. Mrs. Linton's confession faded into the hush of parish whispers, while Clara Whitby and Mrs. Carroway walked home that evening side by side, each lighter for the truths no longer hidden. As for Miss Marple, she sat by her fireside, knitting once more. her thoughts gentle but unstill. She had no pride in what she'd uncovered, only the familiar, bitter-sweet understanding that darkness often grows in the quietest corners, and that kindness, when twisted by fear, can lead even the most respectable among us astray. Outside, the lantern's light trembled once, as if in farewell before settling into stillness. Snow fell softly upon the village roofs, upon empty teacups and unspoken worries, tucking them all beneath its pale comfort. Miss Marple sighed, folded her gloves and smiled faintly into the firelight. The winter would be peaceful now, at least for a while. But peace, as she often reminded herself, was only a polite pause between mysteries. So, dear listener, thank you for joining us by the glow of the lantern for this tale of secrets, sorrow and small mercies. Until our next story at Candlelight Mystery Channel, keep your tea warm, your mind sharp, and your heart ever curious.